The 2020 schedule for Clemson was fairly tough when you look at who they had to play outside of their normal games, the games that are outside of the Atlantic Division. I know there were no divisions last year, but they had to play Notre Dame on the road, who wound up being the second best team in the ACC, and then also they played Miami, who wound up being one of the top teams in the conference. They did avoid North Carolina though, so that was pretty good for Clemson. But they did enough. They did enough to make it through that ACC, get to the ACC championship, and of course make it to the college football playoff. Let's look at this 2021 schedule now, and you see, of course, that big game to start the year off against Georgia in Charlotte. What a game that is going to be. This is the most anticipated week one non-conference games that I can remember. I don't remember a game being bigger than this. We're talking about two teams that will probably be in the top 4 or 5. It's going to be a good one. And before we get into the full schedule, let's look at who Clemson plays outside of their division, because we know they're going to play. They're going back to divisions this year in the ACC, and so we know they're going to play those teams. They play them every year. But how about outside of the division? They'll play Georgia, like we just talked about. They'll also play South Carolina State and UConn. This should be fairly easy work for Clemson in those two matchups. And then they'll play South Carolina again. I'm so glad we get to see the ACC versus SEC rivalries back, and really all the rivalries in the non-conference. Notre Dame, USC, Iowa, Iowa State. I'm so glad that we hopefully will get those games back. They will go on the road to face South Carolina this year. They play Georgia Tech every year. That's their cross-division rival. So, yeah, they play them every year. So the team that it rotates with out of the Coastal Division, that team this year is going to be Pittsburgh. Now, I don't expect Pitt to be one of the top contenders in the Coastal Division, but they always have a pretty good team at least. And the fact that this game is on the road and Pittsburgh has upset Clemson before, maybe this game is a little bit tricky for Clemson. We'll see. Let's see where everything lines up on the schedule as we go back here. Again, that first game against Georgia on September 4th in Charlotte, neutral field. Hopefully we have fans. I think we'll have fans. Hopefully we have full stadiums, at least 50% capacity, something like that. Who knows what it's going to look like? That's many months away, but I'm assuming there'll be a decent amount of fans, and that is going to be, I think, just a huge game. Like I said, cannot wait to see what happens in that game. Potentially just the first matchup of two. We could see those two teams meet again in the college football playoff. So that, again, is going to be a big one. South Carolina State is on September 11th, and then they'll get into ACC play with Georgia Tech on September 18th. NC State on September 25th on the road. Could be a tricky game. NC State has a lot coming back this year. They had a pretty solid year last year. That game again on the road early in the year. That one's interesting. Then we go into the month of October. Boston College at home. Boston College played Clemson really tough last year, and Boston College will have they'll have a decent amount coming back this year. So that'll be an interesting game there as well. Syracuse on October 15th. This game will be on the road. I know Syracuse has done it before, but I'm just looking at this team, and I don't really see them being much of a threat. Pittsburgh on the road on October 23rd. So that's when that game is going to be. And circling back to Syracuse, by the way, that is a Friday night game. I believe when they lost to Syracuse before, I'm thinking that was a Friday night game as well. So that's interesting. But yeah, Pittsburgh will be after Syracuse on October 23rd. Should be an interesting game there. We'll see what happens. And their bye week will actually be between Boston College and Syracuse too, by the way. So they'll have plenty of time to prepare for the Orange. But Pittsburgh right there after a Friday night game. Then they'll play Florida State on October 30th in a game that could be interesting. When you look at Florida State, you first think, they haven't been good in a long time. This should be an easy win. It's at home. But when you look at what Mike Norvell is doing and you look at all the transfers they're bringing in, this is going to be a different Florida State team. I don't know that they're going to be much better, but it's possible if everything kind of gels together there. Seminoles could be a challenge for Clemson. So that will be an interesting game there the day before Halloween. And then we move into the month of November. Louisville on November 6th on the road. Louisville did not have a good year last year, but they still should have an explosive offense with some guys coming back. That could be an interesting game there as well. UConn on November 13th. They're really one of the worst FBS teams right now, so that should not be much of a challenge. Wake Forest on November 20th. always a team that can score some points, but it's home game for Clemson. You got to like their chances there. And then South Carolina on the road, November 27th, the final game of the year. So when you look at the entire schedule, what stands out is really it's not very tough. This is, I mean, yeah, they played Georgia, and that's obviously a very tough non-conference game. After that game, Clemson's going to be a big favorite really in the rest of their games. And there's no area here where I'm thinking, oh, that could be a trap game because they have a big game the next week, because they don't have any big games. I mean, there's really nothing on this schedule that is going to be a big threat for Clemson outside of that Georgia game, which means that Georgia game could potentially be huge. If Clemson were to, say, lose that game to Georgia, and we have Georgia and Alabama undefeated meeting in the SEC championship, it's going to be hard to put Clemson ahead of either one of those teams if they lose to Georgia and they just don't have a very strong schedule. So that is a big game for Clemson, and I don't know that it's a must-win. If they lose, I still think if they run the table and win the ACC, they probably make it into the college football playoff, but it really depends on what happens around the rest of the country. So that is going to be a big game for Clemson, September 4th. Really, their season could come down potentially to that first game of the year.